This week on the Heart of It All, one of the most challenging and emotional aspects for our aging population and for those caring for them, driving. Our friend Dr. Amina Jabbar is here to walk us through all aspects to this potential major change today on the podcast. Hi there, I'm Teri Hart, and welcome to the Heart of It All, a podcast all about caregiving. Many of you have requested this episode, driving. Losing one's license is a major change in life, and not just for the person, but also their caregivers. There's more to coordinate. Sometimes you're met with resistance, and in rural areas, let's face it, transportation options can be incredibly limiting. Not all seniors lose their license. Many continue driving safely and confidently into their 90s and beyond. We want to be really clear that age alone is not the determining factor of being able to continue to drive. Here to break down the conversations, complications, and criteria around seniors and driving, we are so happy to have her back, geriatrician Dr. Amina Jabbar. Dr. Jabbar, welcome back to the Heart of It All.
Thank you. It's lovely to be back.
Way back when we had you on first, I believe it was in January, you said that talking about driving in clinic is one of the most painful things you have to do in your job. Why is that?
If you just kind of think just socially about all the things that people love to do, driving is like pretty high up there. And it's one of these fundamental things that I think we kind of grow up being like, it's the thing that goes, I'm independent. I'm thinking of like my nephew who's like turning 14. 16 can't come fast enough for him, right? There is this thing socially that we have where we talk about how we want to, like, as kids, it's like this marker of I'm all grown up. And so I think that conversation around saying to people it's time to retire from driving means you're losing that. And it's this kind of, you can't ignore the change.
Can't ignore the change. I love that turn of phrase that you use, and I think we'll use it quite a lot. Retire from driving. Why is that language important? Why is using that word versus like losing your license? Why have you adopted the language retire from driving?
I think the nice thing about retiring is a lot of people associated with a nice transition in life too, right? Like you finally retired, you're done with the work aspect of it. And I want people to kind of think of that about driving too. It doesn't have to be a bad thing.
So, knowing that, what are some of the conversations that families and loved ones can have in advance, whether it be with a certain diagnosis or even an age marker? Like, what are the conversations we should be having in advance to make that potential inevitability a little bit easier?
Look, if you've started something, there's going to be a point in your life where you're going to have to stop it. Right? It's just this sort of like transitions of life kind of thing is what I talk to people about. Certainly, I think the most natural way that I kind of think about it, or the easiest way I kind of think about it, well, maybe not the easiest way, the pathway where you have to have the conversation is when I diagnose my patients with dementia. I have to have that conversation with them. It is just for me as a geriatrician, and I would say for a lot of family physicians, for example, who have patients of theirs who have dementia, we have to have that conversation. It's fundamental to people's safety and well-being. So in those circumstances, I say to people, especially when they're in the earlier stages, I say, look, you're doing great right now, but I know you've got a progressive illness. We need to think about what your life is going to be like when you retire from driving, when you stop driving. So that's the easiest way to kind of think about it. I would say for generally, like I think about this in the context of just life changes overall. In the context of thinking about, can I stay living in my place forever? Do I have to move one day? Maybe. And in that same vein, you have to kind of think, can I really drive forever? Probably not. And so I think it's just part of that bigger conversation about like accepting change is going to happen.
And that's really so much about what we talk about week in and week out on this podcast, right? Is like the inevitability of decline. And you are the one
Yeah.
gave me that language. That and I use it all the time, Dr. Jabbar, the inevitability of decline and removing the shame from that.
Yes. Yes.
Here in Ontario, where both you and I are based, the government has decided that the age of 80 is when some criteria changes around you actually possessing a driver's license. So I don't think everybody knows this either. Um, what are the changes that people can expect for themselves or for their loved ones when they enter their 80th year with regards to their driver's license and their possession of it?
So when you hit 80 in Ontario, you have to go renew your license. And at that point, people say, at least online, when you look at the website, they say generally allow yourselves 90 minutes for the assessment. It's generally some kind of written assessment that includes kind of a two relatively broad cognitive tests. They're really easy to find online. One of them is drawing a clock. And another one I think tends to be around like finding letters within a puzzle kind of thing. And the third part of that is a vision test. Because we know that people's visions aren't always great and people aren't as diligent about getting that checked sometimes. So, generally speaking, it includes that as well. So, those are the three big components that, generally speaking, people are looking at. If they are flagged, then you need to have a more in depth assessment.
Do you get your vision checked when you go to renew your driver's license, or do you have to bring a certificate from an ophthalmologist?
I'm pretty sure if what patients of mine have told me is, and this might, it'll definitely will differ across the country, but that they will do a very quick vision check. It's pretty crude and rudimentary from what people have told me. And essentially, like you're kind of reading something on a wall kind of thing.
Okay, so that's what you can expect when you turn 80. But that's not the only way that your license can be impacted. And this is something that people really do not understand. And I
I
say it
know.
because I was one of the people who really did not understand it. How else can your license be affected, Dr. Jabbar?
I always tell my patients when you walk into my office, I may not verbally say to somebody, I am here to assess your driving. I'm always assessing someone's driving. It's just inherently, legally for me as a physician, part of what I do. So, for example, if you end up in the emergency room and the emergency room physician feels like you have a health condition that is going to impact your ability to drive, they are legally obligated to report to the Ministry of Transport in Ontario.
And when they legally report that, they actually physically take your license away, correct?
They don't, actually. They don't. We don't. No, no, we don't. So, technically speaking, the physician isn't taking your license away per se. Right. The way it works is that I write and form to the ministry and say, because of X reason, I think this person is no longer safe to drive. And then generally speaking, what ends up happening is a person will receive a letter from the Ministry of Transport saying that because they were reported to the ministry that their license has been suspended. So, if you go by lawyer speak, I'm not technically the one taking away your license. It's just the MTO. But functionally speaking, it's me, right? Like I don't want to like mince the words around that, right? So functionally it is me reporting somebody.
When my dad had his license revoked or
Yeah.
suspended, whatever language you want to use, it was through an optometrist.
Yes.
He
Yes, health professionals.
so it could be your family doctor, it could be your geriatrician, it could be your optometrist, it could be your emergency room doc.
Could be your physiotherapist. So the reason I say a physiotherapist, if I think we're going to talk about all the things that you need for driving, but one of the things I think about, especially for example, a physiotherapist, if they're assessing your lower extremities, for example, and they don't think you've got that leg strength to be able to maneuver quickly enough between the gas and the brake, you're not safe to drive. Or if you have a back condition where you can't, or your neck condition where you can't check your blind spot, you're not safe to drive. So I have seen our physiotherapists, at least the ones that work with us, in our geriatrics program absolutely be concerned about some of the patients that they end up seeing and sending a report to the Ministry of Transport as a result of it.
Interesting. So this is across the board. Medical professionals have a responsibility to report to the Ministry of Transport that somebody is no longer safe to be operating a motorized vehicle.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Just to be really clear about that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's super important. I really think that it's opaque for a lot of people. They don't understand how this happens. So we mentioned the age of 80 being when the government requires us to go and do that test that we've walked people through, but age isn't the only factor. There's a lot that goes into our abilities to be a responsible driver. What should people be looking for in themselves and in their loved ones?
So when I think about driving, there's a few things, right? Number one, my vision has got to be good. If I've got any condition where it's affecting my peripheries, the outsides of my vision, that's going to end up affecting my safety and being able to drive. Right? So if I only have central vision for whatever reason, if I have medical condition where the sides of my eyes don't work as well and I can't see on the sides, there's no way I could check my blind spots. It's not going to happen. I need to be physically intact enough to be able to turn my neck around a little bit, to be fast enough with my leg, to not have any numbness in my feet, for example. If my feet, for whatever reason, diabetes, prior stroke, whatever it is numb at all, and I can't feel the pedals physically, you can't drive. The other thing to think about, we've talked a little bit about this already, is cognitively. We can talk about driving. Driving is a complex task. You're thinking about multiple things happening at the same time. We always talk about how the highest risk of accidents, particularly when people are getting to that point where we're not sure they're safe to drive anymore, they're most likely to get into an accident when they take a left-hand turn. The data shows it. It's fascinating. It's a really complicated part of driving. When you are in the intersection, you've got to make a big turn with the steering wheel. You've got to look for oncoming traffic, and you've got to look for pedestrians and turn at the same time.
It makes me break into a sweat thinking about it now.
I know, right? Like, I remember when I was learning, it was like the scariest thing ever. And then we haven't even touched on the other medical conditions. So, for example, if you have a history of seizure disorders that's not controlled, you can't drive for at least a year when you've had a seizure. People, when they have diabetes, are told if you're not at least 5, you cannot drive.
Does that mean? Tell me. I don't.
So when you check your blood sugar, if you're less than 5, you're not safe to drive.
I think people just think of a dementia, but it's not. Diabetes is a huge one. What stroke would affect peripheral vision? What other medical conditions?
Yeah, if you have any issues, for example, with, let's say you've got uncontrolled arrhythmias with your heart, that would be definitely an issue where, like, your cardiologist, if it's not controlled, if you don't have a pacemaker in, if things are not going well for you, that's probably another reason why somebody would tell you it's probably not safe to drive right now. If you've had any major surgeries, that's a big one, right? Because you're going to be feeling not great after a while. That's a pretty good segue to also talk about medications. So if you're on lots of pain medications, if you're on medications that change, for example, your kind of sensory stuff, we haven't even talked about like alcohol and drugs or any of that kind of stuff. That's a whole kettle of fish. But definitely, I would say, medications that we think about like lorazepam, clonazepam, sometimes medications that people sometimes take for anxiety that they've been on it for too long. I always worry about those medications in general, but they can also make driving unsafe because you may just not be as cognitively clear as a result of those medications.
It makes me think that there are a lot of people driving, not even just seniors, that shouldn't be driving.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Are there objective tools or tests that people can do that are not, and I don't mean to roll my eyes at the drawing of the clock, but it's one of the things in the world that people do roll their eyes at, I think, Dr.
Yeah,
Jabbar.
I know.
Yeah, I can draw a clock. outside of that, are there any definitive tests or tools that could give us an indication that help people to have the conversation?
There are tests that I do in the office for sure, and I'm happy to talk about them, but I'm going to actually say to people always, like, the big picture is really important. And the thing that I always look at when I've got, like, let's say, children of a person coming to see me in the room with me, I always ask them, "Are you comfortable with grandma driving the kids?" And people will automatically give you a reaction. And you will see them either pause and be like, "No," or "Yes, maybe, I don't know." And then when they do that, "Yeah, yeah, my kids, really?" But I always say to people, that initial reaction that you have is a really good gut check. Like, I'm okay with getting in the car with my dad, but am I okay with my dad driving my children? I don't know, right? Because there's that sense of, like, loss of control when it's your own children. So it's a really good question to ask yourself.
Oh, you bring up such a good point again, that we want these checks and balances, we want these definites, but this is a question of how do you feel in your belly about it?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a big one. There's a couple of other red flags I always ask families about. I ask families if anybody's ever co-piloting, meaning, are you giving directions to the Costco that you've been going to for 10 years? Right? Like, if you've been going to the same Costco for 10 years and you're having to tell the loved one you're sitting next to, "Hey, dad, you've got to take a left here," or "Hey, you've got to turn here." That's always an issue. That's always a concern for me. Reminding your loved one that they've got to stay in the lane, that they're drifting off into another lane. That's a big one. Finding that they consistently have people tailgating them because they're going 5 or 10 clicks slower than everybody else. That's a big one. So those are all of the questions that I ask in clinic.
We've all been in a car with somebody who has exhibited all of those driving traits, and it's uncomfortable. And then you extrapolate that discomfort to having a conversation with them about it. And it makes me wince even more. Like I just want to curl up. So what's some language that you can suggest for adult children of their parents or family members of any kind, caregivers, about talking to somebody about these issues?
So we've already talked about using the language of retiring from driving. I always encourage that one. I think it is really important to name the elephant in the room, to say, your brain is changing, your body is changing. It's just not safe enough for you to drive anymore. And I often say to people, it's actually okay to ask, like, that might be the time if you're lucky enough to have a family doctor, it might be worth, saying, "Hey, can we go in for a conversation with your family doctor about this?" I will be honest, I have lots of family doctors who are really uncomfortable about having that conversation too. So they will often ask the geriatrician, me, to see their patient because they don't want to break the relationship they have with their patient. And so I say, "Look, I'm happy being the bad guy. That's fine. Let me be the one to do the assessment to be like, you're not safe to drive, and just pull the trigger, and you can save that relationship, and that's okay." But all this to say, it's a really hard conversation to have.
Dr. Jabbar, if anybody's going to be a bad guy in my life, I want it to be you. You are the
Sure.
nicest guy I've ever met, ever.
I
Um,
try.
you really are. And I love the simplicity. Again, I think that we complicate things because we throw so much emotion, so much of our own emotion on these issues. And by saying, your mind is changing, your body's changing, it's not safe for you to drive anymore. That doesn't sound awful.
It shouldn't, but I get the emotional trigger.
Is there any language that you would suggest to absolutely not use in these conversations?
One of the things that's really hard when you're in a car with somebody is to label somebody as being safe or unsafe. for them, right? Like that no one's inherently an unsafe person, right? Like it's not you're not an unsafe person. It's just that your capacities to do certain things are changing. So that sometimes is a bit of a it's a bit of a tightrope to have to kind of navigate because it's really hard to make sure that a person understands it's not them that's the problem,
Interesting distinction.
right? Like it's not like you're not trying hard enough. It's not like you didn't practice enough. It's not that you're dumb. It's not that it's none of like I think that's probably one of the big reasons why people have such a hard time with this conversation in general is because so much of it is wrapped up in our own personal self-worth. And the kind of like blaming thing that we often fall into and saying, well, it must have been something I did. Well, it's like, no, it's not thing that you did. It's the human condition.
Yeah, it is the human condition. It's nothing that you did. This is so helpful, I think, to remind people. It's that idea of um the disease exists outside of the person is not the disease. Am I getting am I
Yeah, 100%. You're bang on.
One of the things about driving, and you talked about it at the beginning, is that it's a sense of our independence. It's a sense of our adulthood. It's a coming of age moment. There are a lot of I think successes that we associate with our ability to drive, but it also is such a huge issue because it rolls over into so many different aspects of people's lives.
Yeah.
Driving is our ability to get from one place to another.
Yeah.
Well, how much do we have to have in our back pocket when we're having these conversations or when we begin to have the conversation about retiring from driving? How much do we have to have some solutions or some ideas about what that next chapter looks like practically?
One of the things, I mean, fortunately, because I practice in the Greater Toronto area, we're very fortunate to be in large city-ish areas. And so that means access to ride shares and taxis is relatively plentiful. I always frame it in terms of the cost of your insurance per year. I asked my mother this yesterday. Costs her $2,000 a year for her car insurance. Her car maintenance, my mom doesn't drive that much, so it's like, her tire changes and her oil changes, let's call it 1,500. So we've already got $3,500 a year. Her gas probably costs her, you know, $100 a month, give or take. She doesn't drive that much again, but let's add another $1,000 to that. So we're at what, $4,500? Imagine taking that amount in taxis.
And oftentimes, the taxi driver will help you bring your groceries into your house.
Yes, yes, totally, totally, right? Um, I mean, I get it. Look, I get it's not the same as like me hopping into my own car and going wherever I want. But, in a city or in a relatively large suburb, it's pretty darn close. It's pretty darn close. I think for a lot of people, seeing the meter go up psychologically hurts, right? You're like, oh my God, I just paid $20 for that or $40 for that. But I mean, people don't see necessarily the insurance that they're paying or the maintenance or the gas the same way. So it's like you have to shift your brain in terms of thinking about that.
Right. So the financial aspect is one thing. The emotional aspect is a whole other kettle of fish. And we've heard you see it in your office as we talked about. You said this is one of the, if not the most painful aspect of your clinical practice. And people can get angry.
Oh, yeah.
The spectrum of emotion that people experience at the thought of not being able to drive, let alone the hard and fast, I'm sorry, this is no longer a part of your life, is a lot. And I know that you're a geriatrician, you're not a psychiatrist or a therapist, but that is a huge part of what you do as well. So I am going to ask you about
Yeah.
dealing with that. Let's go to, an extreme emotion of anger and how you continue the conversation or not when you're met with that emotion.
That's a great question. I have now certainly had multiple patients who get so angry and upset at me, they storm out, right? And I never see them again. It happens. And at that point, I always say to people, it's more about how they are feeling about themselves than what I did or didn't do. Like it's always that, right? It's never personal. It's this like sometimes it's just easier to take it out on somebody else. And that's okay. That's fine. I will say though, I would say 85, 90% of the time, I've had patients come back to me and say, Dr. Jabbar, I'm really, really sorry for what I did. And they come around to it because you just need some time to kind of figure out how you're coping and what you're doing and all of that stuff. That's fine. I often name the anger. I do. I say to them often, I get you're angry. I get you're pissed off. Literally is how I say it. I would be too, because the thing you're fundamentally trying to confront is the fact that your body and your brain are changing. And that's hard and it sucks.
Can I add another thing in there that
Yeah.
you and I have talked about and I feel very strongly about is that, ageism in our society is such a scourge and I think holds people back from recognizing the natural decline and therefore holds them back from getting a hearing aid, holds them back from getting their eyes tested, holds them back from doing the financial analysis of driving in cabs or Ubers versus having a car themselves.
Getting a walker.
Getting a walker, getting a walker. Can we address those bigger issues as well?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's not unusual for me to have that whole conversation, unfortunately, in one session. There's a reason why I have 90 minutes booked for a first session, right? Because, if I'm talking to somebody about retiring from driving, I'm also saying to them fundamentally, you need to start thinking about moving away from your 3-story house that you've lived in for 50 years. You need to start thinking about putting in a chairlift. There's all of these changes all kinda coupled together, and so you have to, I think, frame it in a bigger context, but I also say to people, I one of the things that I think is the most important thing to do is kind of acknowledge that your grief and anger are not only yours, that this is something that many people are going through, that this is an extremely common experience, and I see this hundreds, if not 1,000 times a year.
What we haven't talked about are the people who it's that gut feeling and they're having the conversation that maybe they don't have a GP. They don't have a GP, they
Yeah,
probably do not have a geriatrician. Maybe that person isn't 80 yet. Maybe they've got a few years until they're 80 and are going for that test, but they
yeah.
know that this person should no longer be operating a motorized vehicle. And that person says, I don't care what you're saying. I'm driving anyway. Those stories occur. People DM us on our socials and say that they're in that situation with a parent, an uncle, a grandparent. What does one do?
So I will say this kind of reminds me of the subset of people that I sometimes see in my office who they're like, I don't care what you say. I think I'm still good enough to drive. And I say to them, do you want to prove it to me? And they, of course, invariably say, yes. Now, the caveat is it does cost a lot of money, but there are actually in car assessments that you can actually have done in Ontario. If you Google driving assessment Ontario, you will find a Government of Ontario page of um, approved assessment centers for driving. And I say to them, look, I, as a professional, am legally obligated to report you. However, if you would like to prove me otherwise, you are more than welcome to go to one of these assessment centers, have the driving assessment done, and come back to me with the result. And if I am wrong, I am happy to write a different letter to the MTO. The caveat it is, though, this is a lot of money. It's $500. It's a lot of money. But sometimes it does give you an out, right? It sometimes you just need to have, another set of eyes to be able to kind of say that. I've also certainly had some people where I'm like, I'm kind of on the fence, and even they themselves feel kind of on the fence, or they've had families where things are like truly gray, and they will figure out a way to scrape the money to go do it and then come back and we'll have a conversation about it. I think when things are tottering and teetering a little bit, I always say that's always a good time to think about retiring anyway. So the driving assessment's a good way to go. Now, in the circumstances where, let's say, I have given a person all of the evidence possible, and generally speaking, 99% of the time, this is somebody who has underlying dementia and just doesn't have the insight and the judgment because of the deficits of the dementia itself to appreciate that they're not safe to drive. The things that I often have to say to families is take away the keys. It's hard. It stinks. I remember I had one family where they could not physically take the keys away. So they literally, I think, cut the access to the engine. So you couldn't actually start the car. I've had some families for sure just take the reminder of the vehicle away from the house because it's too painful.
Yeah, I've seen that too. I've heard from people saying like the car is just magically no longer there anymore. It's not always the person who shouldn't be driving anymore. Oftentimes, or sometimes, it is the family who is resistant to having the conversation. They don't want to go down the anger path. They don't want to go down all of the things we've talked about. And they're just like, well, we're going to let it happen until something bad happens. What do you say about that?
I will give you another alternative to what I hear about that when families are like, but they're only driving across the street, right? They're not going on the highway. They're just going to the grocery store. And so the thing I say to people in that context is that the vast majority of accidents happen within a few kilometers of home. Always. It's closest to home when the most accidents happen. That's like just statistically from the research perspective we know. The second thing I say to people is I cannot wait until the accident happens in order to take away your license. Or to report you to the MTO is actually what I should accurately be saying. That's the other thing. And so unfortunately, the way that which things are set up in Ontario is it's an all or nothing thing. It's not a graduated, hey, you can drive on something. You can drive on the local roads during when it's bright out and only sun is out kind of thing. You can't drive when it's like stormy and rainy and dark. It's just not the way that the Ontario law works, unfortunately. And I do actually frankly share with people that I'm actually legally in trouble, technically speaking. I actually can be found culpable if I have a patient who I was concerned about with driving and actually didn't report. And the other thing is that like driving is a communal experience. Yes, I absolutely realize and understand that there's lots of people on the road I see all the time where I'm like, you shouldn't be on the road. But just because they shouldn't be on the road doesn't mean your dad or your parent does get to be on the road if I think they're unsafe, right? Like, so that's one of the other bits and pieces we have to think about. And so if part of my calculation is not only the safety of your loved one when I'm reporting to the MTO, but of everybody else around them.
Absolutely. And another thing that, doing some research to talk to you about this, the fact is it's not necessarily that seniors are responsible for more accidents on the road. That actually is not the case. But what is true is that seniors that are in accidents are more profoundly injured in that accident. So you're like, well, they're just driving around the corner. What's going to happen? A fender bender. Sure, it might just be a fender bender, but if that fender bender results in a concussion, whiplash, a broken wrist, ankle, all of those things can have a profound effect on a senior and their general well-being in a way that you're not thinking of as a non-senior. Fair?
100%. I think that's really, really insightful.
If they drive up on the side of a curb and drive into a post, no other person, no other thing is around, that could start a domino effect that is really, really dangerous.
Absolutely. That risk of delirium, the decline that you take, as you get older, your reserve goes down. I think I've talked about this before. Your reserve isn't just as good as you were when you were in your 20s. So often, it's not unusual when I have loved ones say to me, "Oh my God, it feels like they just fell off a cliff." Yeah, because their ability to keep their body in the range of normal isn't as great anymore. So absolutely, knowing that you're at higher risk of those kinds of effects and the long-standing impacts, like you've pointed out, is a really big one.
You just mentioned that, there's no graduated license decline in Ontario. I'm assuming in other provinces in Canada as well. There's no gradual decline legally for your license. But is there anything that you could do domestically that maybe could lead towards the retirement of driving with your loved one that might be helpful, Dr. Jabbar?
I've actually suggested to people, and people have actually taken this up. Is I have said to people, if you actually even just want to get a couple of sessions with a driving teacher, just like if you don't want to do a formal big driving assessment, like I mentioned earlier, but if you want to get an hour, a couple of hours with a driving teacher in the car just to kind of see where you're at, it's not a bad idea, right? Particularly, for example, I say this to people around like if you are, for whatever reason, a little bit nervous around winter driving, getting a bit of a tune up session from a driving instructor is not a bad thing.
Oh my gosh, you just gave me a good idea. I don't know, maybe it's not a good idea. You know how I
No.
come up with these things. Imagine if you could say to somebody, if they said, because I think somebody would be confident saying or comfortable saying, "Oh, I don't want to drive in January. I'm nervous about driving in January." And you're like, "You know what? Don't drive in January. Why don't you take some cabs in January?"
Yeah, why not?
And is that the beginning of like, "Oh, see, that worked out pretty well. Maybe you don't need to drive in February." And then by the time it comes around to spring, and listen, spring doesn't come until June in this province these days. Maybe you have had that, slow kind of awareness that life is possible without driving your own vehicle.
I think that is brilliant, Terry. I do. I really do. It's one of the reasons why a lot of retirement homes actually offer this whole like try us out for a month thing. And then they just end up staying because they like it so much. It's not that different. It's a great idea. January is a great time to start trying to do the cabs, trying to do the Uber, trying to do whatever it is that you're going to do, whatever rideshare you're going to do. It's not a bad idea.
We cannot mention it enough, I think, especially in this episode, is that you and I both come to this with so much empathy of how difficult this is. So I think that it's really important that people understand how much we both know is really hard.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. As you were talking, actually, the one thing I think I haven't said yet, which is probably worth saying, just in terms of structures, right? Like, because I try to think about these are the things that are happening to everybody, and how do we change the system fundamentally to help? One of the things that's actually available in Mississauga that I actually don't know if it's definitely not available in Toronto. So for people who have access to what we call either wheel trans or trans help in Mississauga and in Toronto, if you have a walker, you can get a more kind of like a pickup, a more private pickup from public transit, and you pay a public transit fare. It's a great option. However, the thing that's really painful about it sometimes is they give you a big window. They say, well, we're going to pick you up anywhere between 1 and 2 p.m. and we'll pick you up again on the other end between. People hate it. However, the thing that I love in Mississauga that Peel does specifically is if you qualify for that service, you also qualify for reduced taxi chits. meaning you can buy $40 worth of taxis for $25. It is huge, right? The region subsidizes that. Toronto does not do that. And I actually don't know anywhere in Ontario else that does that, but definitely it is available to many of the patients that I see in Mississauga.
This is the infrastructure. This is what we mean when we talk about support for seniors. This is
Yes.
what we mean when we talk about support for caregivers. These institutional decisions, these government support that would be absolutely accessed and would make a huge difference.
For somebody who is on a fixed income, when you have an X amount of money, that's a huge stretch for people. To pay $25 for $40 worth of taxis is huge.
And I don't know about the percentage of patients that come into your office, your patients are seniors, but most seniors I know, they like a deal.
Yes! Who doesn't like that deal? That's a great deal.
Right?
It's a huge deal. It's amazing.
I mean, it's great. Just finally, how do you think we should all collectively, as society, try to think about driving in relation to the natural decline of aging?
One of the things that I really think about with driving, and the reason why I do get concerned about people when they stop driving or unable to drive anymore, is the social isolation that comes with it. Right? It's so hard, especially in January and February, where as it is, you can't get outside to the sidewalks, everything is icy, you just can't get around. So I think from a community perspective, and again, thinking about infrastructure, I think about, how is it that we look out for each other? And how is it that we have community services set up for people? So one of the things that, I think about all the time is, especially if you have neighbors that are older, if you happen to have people around you that are that way, or for example, if you're in a building where, let's say an apartment building or a condo building with someone that's older, I've had lots of instances where patients of mine who I do home visits for, will say, my neighbor is lovely. They'll take me grocery shopping. Or they'll ask me before they go out for something if they can go get me a bag of milk. Right? Like those are the kinds of things you kind of think about from a community perspective that are really, really important to kind of figure out and build. Um, if you're fortunate enough to be relatively close to a community center, I would hope, and we need to have more infrastructure where people can easily get to community centers and actually get out to do those kinds of things. And again, like I have so many patients of mine, for example, where church or some kind of religious practice is a big part of their life.
Mhm.
There are communities, like sort of circles there where people will be like, I'm going to pick you up on the way to service.
Is what I'm hearing from you that we all need to recognize that driving is something that as we age will change, and we need to be aware of how that change is affecting the people who are in our circle.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Like, if my mom stops driving, when she stops driving, I should say, when that time comes, me as her daughter and my sister and my brother, we're going to have to, as the trio of us, figure out how do we not only help her make sure that she gets the things that she needs, but also ensuring that she's getting out to do all the things that she wants to do. And so it shouldn't just fall on family anyway. It's always a community thing. It's always a community thing. It's way too much for children to just carry on their own completely. It has to be a community thing. I'm always thinking about how do we get governments to build that infrastructure? And it's a hard, hard sell. But ultimately, if I had to kind of create something from the ground up, that's what you would kind of really do.
You said the first time we had you on the podcast, community will save us.
Yes. Always. It's
See,
community that always saves us.
I have a lot of Dr. Jabbarisms in my head. And I'm so grateful for them all. Thank you so much for being here. As always, so good. I'm sure you'll be back sooner rather than later.
Anytime.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jabbar.
Thank you.
Well, there's no doubt that losing our driving privileges is a huge life change, and the impacts are far and wide. This is one of the many issues that employing maximum empathy will serve everyone so well. When my dad lost his license, he was incredibly brave and practical about it. But I remember asking him if he missed driving, and he said, "It's just another thing I can't do anymore." It made him sad, and it made me sad. These are huge transitions, and we hope this episode is helpful to make it a bit smoother. Thanks to Dr. Jabbar for her amazing insights, and my co-producers, Jess and Carrie from 6 of 1 Digital. And thanks to you for being here and following us on our social channels at the Heart of It All Pod. We do appreciate your comments and follows. As always, please take care. We are going way, way back for this week's recommendation, all the way back to 1989, a movie that was nominated for all kinds of Oscars. It won Best Picture. Can you guess? Driving Miss Daisy. Oh, doesn't it warm your heart just thinking about it? In fairness, I haven't watched this movie in a really long time, but I think it still holds up. Of course, it is Morgan Freeman and Jessica Tandy in a movie about two people who are discovering each other in a situation where he is responsible for driving her around. It is Driving Miss Daisy. It is this week's recommendation for the Heart of It All.